The hedgerows of Normandy were supposed to be France, green, peaceful, full of orchards and sunlight. Instead, in the summer of 1944, they became a nightmare. Each field was a fortress, each hedgerow a wall of earth and stone 3 feet thick, lined with roots and brambles centuries old. Every farmhouse hid a German machine gun. Every lane was a killing ground. After the triumph of D-Day, the Allied advance had stalled just a few miles inland. For nearly 7 weeks, American soldiers of the First Army clawed forward yard by yard, through mud, smoke, and blood. Men fell in ditches, mowed down by unseen MG-42s. Tanks burned in the narrow lanes, unable to climb the hedgerows that hemmed them in. It was a battlefield that swallowed technology and nullified advantage. You couldn't see 50 feet ahead, one GI remembered. The Germans could be anywhere, and they always were. Across the lines, Hitler's elite Panzer Lehr division waited, dug in with grim precision. Formed from the best training units of the Wehrmacht, Panzer Lehr was considered one of the finest armored divisions in the world, a steel hammer forged to hold back the Allies. Its tanks hid beneath camouflage nets and apple trees, its guns sighted on the narrow approaches to Saint-Lô. Even after the devastation of D-Day, these men still believed in victory. They were fighting not for ground, but for the Reich itself. The Americans needed a miracle to break them, and that miracle would come from the sky. In early July 1944, as General Omar Bradley surveyed his maps in a tent near Carentan, he realized the Normandy campaign was choking to death. "We're losing men for inches," he told his staff. "We need a hole, not a crack, not a dent, a hole." His plan, codenamed Operation Cobra, would be simple and brutal. He would unleash the full power of American air superiority on a single section of the German line. When the bombing stopped, his tanks would surge through the wreckage and explode into open country. The idea was daring, perhaps reckless. Never before had such a concentrated air bombardment been attempted directly in front of friendly ground troops. To make it work, thousands of bombers would have to strike within a mile of their own lines, precisely, relentlessly, without pause. The target? The Panzer Lehr Division, entrenched west of Saint-Lô, the iron wall that held back the U.S. Army. Bradley called in the commanders of the 8th Air Force, the most powerful armada of bombers the world had ever seen. They had come to France from England's cold airfields, men who had spent years bombing the factories and cities of Germany. Now they were being asked to turn that same destruction on a patch of French countryside for a single purpose: to blast a hole through Hitler's wall. The weapon for the job would be the B-24 Liberator, the heavy bomber that symbolized American industry as much as the Jeep or the Sherman tank. Sleek and powerful, with its twin bomb bays and wide wings, the Liberator could carry more explosives farther than any bomber before it. By the summer of 1944, thousands of them roared daily from England's runways, built in factories that never slept. Ford's Willow Run, Consolidated San Diego plant, and scores more across America. To the men who flew them, the B-24 was both a miracle and a menace. She could take you anywhere, but she'd fight you every inch of the way. Her controls were heavy, her cockpit cramped, her engines temperamental. But when she lifted into the sky, her power was undeniable. Fully loaded, each carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. Multiplied by thousands, it was not just force, it was an industrial avalanche. In July, that avalanche was pointed at Normandy. At the same time, in the German trenches outside Saint-Lô, soldiers of Panzer Lehr prepared for another American attack. They had been fighting without rest since June, their ranks reduced by half, their supply lines shattered by Allied fighter bombers, yet morale held. Their commander, Fritz Bayerlein, believed his veterans could hold forever. He wrote in his diary, "They will not break us here. We will make Normandy their grave." But high above them, the storm was gathering. From the airfields of East Anglia and southern England, hundreds of B-24s began to assemble. It was a sight unlike anything the world had seen. Formation after formation rising through the morning haze, engines droning in perfect unison. At 8:30 a.m. on July 25, 1944, over 1,500 bombers, B-24 Liberators, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and medium bombers formed up in a sky that stretched from horizon to horizon. Inside each Liberator, the crews went through the ritual of war. The bombardiers checked their Norden sights. The gunners loaded belts of .50 caliber rounds. The pilots adjusted their oxygen masks and glanced at photographs of wives and sweethearts taped to the instrument panels. Below them, the green fields of England slipped away, replaced by the gray expanse of the Channel. They crossed into France just as the morning sun burned through the mist. Ahead lay the German front and the small, doomed villages that stood between the two armies. On the ground, the men of Panzerlehr heard it first, a distant hum, growing into a roar. They looked up and saw the sky darken. A German corporal shouted, "Flieger! Flieger!" Then the world vanished in fire. The first wave of B-24s dropped from 20,000 feet. The air filled with the whistle of falling bombs, then the thunder of detonation. The ground convulsed. Trees snapped like twigs. Trenches collapsed, burying men alive. Tanks flipped over like toys. One German officer described it later, "It was not bombing. It was the end of the world." For 2 straight hours, the B-24s and B-17s turned the battlefield into an inferno. Columns of smoke rose 5,000 feet high, visible all the way to Cherbourg. Roads disappeared, communications broke. Entire companies of German soldiers ceased to exist, erased not by bullets but by pressure and shock. From the air, it was impossible to see individual targets, only waves of smoke and flame. The Liberator crews flew through the black clouds, bomb bays open, engines howling. "We could feel the heat through the glass," one pilot said. Down there, nothing was alive. But the cost of such fury was chaos. A few bomb groups dropped short, their payloads falling among American lines. Bradley's men, crouched in their foxholes, were torn apart by friendly bombs meant for the enemy. "The earth came up and hit us," one GI said later. "Then it hit us again." Over 100 American soldiers were killed by the mistake. Yet when the bombing stopped, the silence that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. The German front was gone. The fields west of Saint-Lô were nothing but smoke and craters. The Panzerlehr Division, the pride of Hitler's army, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Half its tanks were destroyed, its command post obliterated, its survivors wandering in shock through what had been, only hours before, a defensive line. "There is no line, only death," one captured officer muttered. From his command post, Omar Bradley stared through binoculars at the smoke columns rising from the horizon. He turned to his aide and said quietly, "That's the hole." The time of the Liberators had come. Part 2. The Builders of Thunder, 1940 to 1944. The story of the B-24 Liberator did not begin in the skies over Normandy. It began 4 years earlier, in a hangar in San Diego, with a group of engineers staring at a blank sheet of paper. The year was 1939. Europe was at war. America was not. Yet in the offices of Consolidated Aircraft, one man, Reuben Fleet, founder and visionary, believed the United States would soon need a bomber faster, stronger, and longer-ranged than anything flying. Boeing already had its flying fortress, the B-17, but Fleet wanted to build something different, something that could outclimb the B-17, fly farther than any enemy interceptor, and carry more bombs than any aircraft in the world. From that ambition came the Consolidated Model 32, soon to be christened the B-24 Liberator. It was unlike anything else in the sky.
a sleek, high-wing design with twin bomb bays and a revolutionary Davis airfoil wing that promised efficiency and lift far beyond its rivals. On paper, it was an engineer's dream, capable of 300 miles per hour, a 2,800-mile range, and a bomb load that could cripple a city. In the air, it would prove both a triumph and a torment. When the prototype first lifted off from Lindbergh Field in December 1939, it flew beautifully, fast, steady, and full of potential. But the men who flew it also discovered its curse. The controls were heavy, the cockpit visibility poor, the structure complicated. The Liberator demanded skill, muscle, and endurance. It would kill the careless, but reward the patient. As war swept across Europe, the design went from blueprint to legend. In 1940, Britain, desperate for aircraft to fight Hitler's Luftwaffe, ordered the first batch of B-24s under Lend-Lease. The Royal Air Force was the first to fly them in combat, using them for long-range patrols over the Atlantic. But it was America's entry into the war that transformed the B-24 from an experimental design into a weapon of industrial power. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States possessed only a handful of heavy bombers. Within months, that would change. Across the nation, factories that had once built cars and farm equipment began producing aircraft instead. And at the heart of this transformation stood Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a facility that would become the symbol of American production genius. Willow Run was unlike any factory the world had ever seen. Designed by Charles Sorensen, Ford's legendary production manager, it stretched over 3.5 million square feet. Its assembly line ran a full mile from start to finish. Every 63 minutes, a complete B-24 rolled out of its hangar doors, polished, armed, and ready for war. Men, women, and teenagers worked in shifts around the clock, riveting aluminum panels, wiring cockpits, painting insignias. "We built airplanes like we used to build Fords," one worker said. It was not just a factory, it was a statement. America could outbuild any enemy. By 1944, the B-24 was being produced not only at Willow Run, but at plants across California, Texas, and Oklahoma. Over 18,000 Liberators would eventually be built, more than any other heavy bomber in history. They would serve on every front, in Europe, Africa, the Pacific, and the Arctic. From the deserts of North Africa to the ice fields of Norway, wherever there was war, the Liberators' long wings would follow. Yet behind every statistic were the men who flew them, the crews who called themselves Liberator men. They trained in the dust and heat of Texas and Arizona, learning to trust each other more than the machines they flew. Each B-24 carried a crew of 10, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, and 5 gunners. They lived together, trained together, and often died together. They learned how to handle an aircraft that was both powerful and temperamental. The Liberator's tricycle landing gear made it stable on runways, but fragile in crosswinds. Its long, thin wing made it fast, but prone to abrupt stalls. "She'll take you anywhere, but she'll punish you if you get lazy," one instructor warned. For these men, the Liberator became a second home, a flying fortress in its own right. They painted names on the nose: the dragon and his tail, Witchcraft, Teggy Ann, the Strawberry Bitch. The planes became living things, their aluminum skins covered in exhaust streaks and patched bullet holes. When a crew returned from a mission, ground men would greet them like ghosts come back from the dead. And they often had reason to feel that way. Flying a B-24 into Germany was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. At 20,000 feet, the cold could freeze a man's fingers to metal in seconds. Flak burst around them in black clouds, each explosion sending shards of steel slicing through fuselages. German fighters, FW-190s, BF-109s would dive straight through formations, guns blazing. Liberator crews fought back with 50 caliber machine guns mounted in every direction. But even if they survived the fighters, the flak could still tear them apart. Every mission felt like a coin toss, recalled Lieutenant Bill Adams, who flew with the 466 bomb group. You climbed, you froze, you prayed. You dropped your bombs and turned for home. And when you landed, if you landed, you felt like you'd stolen your life back. But when they did make it home, the results were devastating. German rail yards, oil refineries, and submarine pens crumbled under the weight of their bombs. The B-24s that had begun as experimental prototypes were now rewriting the nature of warfare. They could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs farther and faster than anything the enemy could stop. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force had turned Western Europe into a laboratory of destruction. From England's fields, daily waves of B-17s and B-24s darkened the sky. The Germans called them Terrorflieger, terror flyers. But what terrified them most was not the bombs, but the rhythm. The raids never stopped. Even when the smoke still hung over yesterday's ruins, more bombers would come. That rhythm, that relentless mechanical pulse, was the heartbeat of American industry echoing across the Atlantic. And when the Allied armies were trapped in the hedgerows of Normandy, that same heartbeat would be summoned again, not against cities or factories, but against an army in the field. Operation Cobra would be the first time the full power of the B-24 Liberator was turned from strategic bombing to tactical destruction. It would be the moment when industrial warfare came down from the clouds, when a machine built in a Michigan factory changed the course of the war on a single day in July. The builders of thunder had done their part. Now it was time for their creation to strike.
The morning of July 25th began with silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Over the rolling fields and shattered villages west of St. Lo, dawn crept through smoke and mist. The hedgerows stood like walls of green stone. In the ditches, American infantry waited, their helmets wet with dew, their hands clenched on rifle stocks slick with sweat. Somewhere beyond those hedgerows lay the Panzer Lehr Division, the iron shield of Hitler's Western defense. At 8:30 hours, the silence broke. From the north came a low, growing rumble. Not thunder, not artillery, but something deeper, mechanical, endless. The men in the trenches looked up. The sky itself seemed to move. First came the escort fighters, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, silver streaks glinting in the light. Then the bombers appeared, wave after wave, formation after perfect formation. They filled the horizon, B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, hundreds upon hundreds, climbing in staggered boxes that caught the morning sun like an armada of steel. The sound was a living thing. It rolled across the countryside, shaking windows, rattling helmets, vibrating through the bones. To the men below, it felt like watching the ocean lift into the air. In one Liberator, the Duchess of Dallas, pilot Lieutenant Tom Kiefer squinted through the haze. Below him stretched a sea of smoke, craters, and flashes of light. "Target ahead," came the call over the intercom. "Panzer Lehr positions, St. Lo sector." Kiefer's bombardier, Lieutenant Mike Russo, adjusted the Norden sight, aligning crosshairs on a faint line of road barely visible through dust. "Bombs armed," Russo said. "God help the poor bastards down there." At 20,000 feet, the temperature hovered near freezing. The engines roared at full throttle. The smell of oil and sweat mixed with cold air leaking through the fuselage seams. Kiefer steadied the formation as the lead ship's bomb bay doors opened. One by one, the others followed. When the green light blinked on, 10,000 bomb bay doors swung open in unison. On the ground, German artillery officer Captain Hans Wilke had been studying his map when he heard it, the sound of 1,000 engines rolling toward him. He stepped out of his bunker, looked up, and froze. He later wrote, "The sky was filled with planes. The sun disappeared. I could see nothing else. Then the earth began to move." The first bombs fell in long, rippling waves, their whistling descent ending in detonations so powerful they lifted the ground like a heartbeat. Trees, vehicles, men, all were thrown into the air. The shock waves rolled through the soil, snapping telephone wires, flipping over tanks, collapsing trenches. Smoke and dirt rose in pillars hundreds of feet high, swallowing everything. The B-24s came in 3 massive groups, spaced by minutes, but timed with machine precision. For nearly 2 hours, the bombardment never stopped. Each wave overlapped the next until the landscape became one continuous, boiling sea of explosions. Inside the German positions, discipline disintegrated. Panzerlehr's tanks, hidden under camouflage nets, were hurled aside like toys. Fuel trucks erupted, sending fountains of fire skyward. Machine gun crews were buried alive as their bunkers imploded. "It was like being inside a furnace," one survivor said. "We could not breathe. We could not hear. We could not move." Even the Americans crouched in foxholes less than a mile behind the bombardment felt the shock in their chests. "The ground was breathing," said Private First Class Jim Parker of the 30th Infantry. "It rose and fell like waves. You could taste the dirt in your teeth. And the sound? It wasn't sound anymore. It was just power." Not all the bombs fell where they were meant to. A few formations, disoriented by smoke and crosswinds, released too early. The deadly rain fell among friendly lines, tearing apart units waiting to advance. We saw men vanish, just gone. The sky was killing everyone. But even with that horror, the operation continued. There was no stopping it. The scale of the mission was beyond recall, beyond control. It was the raw translation of industry into destruction. In the sky above, the Liberator crews could see none of it. They flew through walls of smoke and fire, blinded by flashes, buffeted by turbulence so violent it felt like being struck by invisible fists. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages. One B-24, hard to get, lost an engine and spiraled out of formation, its crew bailing out into the inferno below. "We flew through our own shock waves," recalled Bombardier Mike Russo. "The plane shook like it wanted to tear itself apart. Then the light came through the smoke, and we knew we'd made it." By 10:30, the last bomb bays closed. The formations turned north, engines droning in weary unison as they climbed back into the clear blue. Below them, the battlefield had gone. What had once been a network of hedgerows and villages was now a single unbroken wasteland, a scar of craters, twisted steel, and blackened earth stretching for miles. Panzerlehr Division, once one of Germany's most elite units, had been annihilated in a morning. Over 70% of its tanks and vehicles were destroyed. Hundreds of its men were dead, hundreds more wounded or missing. "We ceased to exist," wrote General Fritz Bayerlin. "There was no command, no communication, only death." When the bombing ended, General Omar Bradley stepped outside his command tent near the front. The ground was still trembling. Columns of smoke rose into the sky, their shadows drifting east like ghosts. "That's the hole," he said quietly. Then he gave the order, "Send them in." The waiting American armor, hundreds of Shermans, half-tracks, and trucks, surged forward. Through the smoke, they advanced into a world unrecognizable, a graveyard of broken tanks and shattered trees. German resistance was scattered and stunned. Many surrendered without a fight. Others simply wandered, deafened and shell-shocked. In the words of one GI, it wasn't a battle, it was an ending. As the B-24s returned to their bases in England, the crews could see the smoke columns still visible across the channel. They didn't yet know the full scale of what they had done, that in 2 hours they had erased an entire division and changed the course of the campaign. But they knew one thing: they had seen what air power could do when unleashed without restraint. For the men in those liberators, the day would remain burned into memory, not as triumph alone, but as awe. "We didn't win that day," said pilot Tom Kiefer years later. "The sky did."
When the thunder stopped, there was only smoke. The horizon, once lined with hedgerows and farmhouses, had become a wall of black. The air smelled of oil, cordite, and burning flesh. It was as though the earth itself had been peeled open and left to bleed. The American infantry who rose from their foxholes that morning found not a battlefield, but an empty world. There was nothing left alive, one GI wrote. Only craters and ghosts walking. General Omar Bradley's radio crackled to life at 11 a.m. "The line is open," a forward observer reported. "The Germans are gone." Bradley didn't wait. He turned to his staff and gave the order that every man in the Allied army had been waiting to hear since D-Day. "Send the armor." From behind the lines came a sound unlike the bomber's thunder, but just as steady. The deep mechanical growl of tanks, half-tracks, and trucks. The U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions surged forward through the shattered countryside, the steel tide that would turn the Normandy stalemate into a breakout. The ground itself shook beneath their tracks. Men coughed through the dust clouds kicked up by their own advance. Tankers leaned from their turrets, eyes wide at the sight of wreckage. German half-tracks were overturned like children's toys. Tanks had been blown in half, their turrets flung 50 yards away. The once mighty Panzer-Lehr division was gone, a rumor on the wind. "Nothing could have survived that bombardment," one American sergeant said, and nothing did. The advance gathered speed almost instantly. Bradley's plan, codenamed Operation Cobra, had worked with terrifying precision. Within hours, American forces pushed 6 miles past St. Lo. Within a day, they had driven 12. What had been a war of hedgerows became a war of movement again. German soldiers who managed to survive the bombing fled in disarray, abandoning guns and vehicles in their retreat. Prisoners stumbled out of the smoke with their hands raised, eyes blank. "They were broken men," said a corporal from the 9th Infantry Division. "They'd been crushed from above. You could see it in their faces. They weren't fighting anymore." For the first time since landing in France, the Americans had room to maneuver. Tank commanders shouted coordinates into radios, columns of Shermans fanning out toward the open countryside. Supply trucks roared forward behind them, loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations. Engineers filled shell craters and built bridges over shattered roads. The army that had been trapped in the hedgerows was now racing across France. The Germans, meanwhile, were in chaos. The Luftwaffe was gone, swept from the sky. Communications between divisions had collapsed in the bombardment. Units retreated without orders. In Berlin, reports of the disaster at St. Lo spread through the high command like shock waves. Hitler refused to believe it. He ordered counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed. But the truth was simple. The front was broken. By July 27th, 2 days after the bombing, the Americans had broken through the German defensive belt completely. St. Lo, the city that had been bombed into rubble, now lay behind them. Ahead stretched open farmland, the gateway to Brittany, and beyond that, Paris. The breakout had begun. As the armored divisions thundered south and west, they moved under skies filled not with bombers now, but with the same B-24 Liberators flying a different mission: resupply. The very bombers that had shattered the German lines now carried crates of fuel, food, and ammunition to keep the advance moving. The air war and ground war had merged into one continuous machine. The German command tried desperately to plug the gap. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, commanding Army Group B, scraped together remnants of panzer units from across France, but they had nothing left that could stop the tide. The few tanks that made it to the front were easy prey for Allied fighter bombers prowling overhead. P-47 Thunderbolts dove from the sky, their 8 machine guns shredding columns of trucks and convoys. "We owned the air," one American pilot said. "They couldn't move a jeep without us knowing it." In the villages liberated by the advance, French civilians wept and cheered as American convoys rolled through. Children handed out flowers. Old men waved tricolor flags hidden since 1940. For the first time in 4 years, hope moved faster than fear. Far behind the lines, at an airfield in England, a group of exhausted B-24 crews sat on the ground beside their aircraft, eating from tin mess kits. The smell of oil and burnt metal still clung to their clothes. A news bulletin came over the field radio. "Operation Cobra, successful. Allied forces have broken through German lines near St. Lo." No one cheered. They just sat in silence, looking at the horizon. "We didn't feel like heroes," one pilot later said. "We felt like we'd dropped the sky itself on those men. But if that's what it took to end it, then it had to be done." The cost was heavy. Nearly 500 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded by bombs that fell short during the opening strike. Yet the result was undeniable. The German front in Normandy had ceased to exist. The official reports described it in simple terms: enemy resistance collapsing, rapid advance continuing. But the soldiers who saw it knew better. It wasn't just resistance collapsing, it was the very idea of German invincibility. By early August, the Allied armies were pouring through the gap. Patton's newly activated Third Army burst into the open, sweeping across western France with breathtaking speed. Town after town fell in days. At Avranches, the Americans broke into open country, their tanks now racing down roads unguarded. Their supply lines stretched thin but unbroken. For the German army, it was the beginning of the end. At Falaise 2 weeks later, their retreating divisions would be trapped and annihilated in one of the greatest encirclements of the war. But it all began with that moment west of St. Lo, the moment when the B-24 Liberators tore a hole in Hitler's wall. From that day forward, the German army would never again hold a continuous defensive line in France. In his after-action report, General Bradley wrote with restrained pride, "The bomber is not merely a weapon of the air, it is the spearhead of the ground." He was right. Operation Cobra had changed the rules of war. It proved that air power could do more than destroy factories or terrorize cities. It could shape the battlefield itself, bending the course of armies and nations. The Liberators had not just bombed an enemy, they had blasted open the future.
By the first week of August 1944, the roads of Normandy no longer echoed with artillery. They thundered with the sound of victory. Columns of American tanks stretched from one horizon to the other, pushing west toward Brittany and east toward Paris. The breakout had become a flood. What had started as a desperate gamble, a carpet bombing on the edge of friendly lines, had turned into one of the most decisive operations of the Second World War. The Allies had cracked Hitler's wall wide open. In the smoldering fields around Saint-Lô, the wreckage of the Panzerlehr division still burned. Twisted steel, melted tracks, and shattered helmets littered the cratered ground. German prisoners stumbled past their own wrecked vehicles in disbelief. "We thought no one could survive under bombs like that," one captured soldier said. "We were right." The survivors of the American infantry moved through that landscape with silent awe. "It looked like another planet," Sergeant Paul Devine of the 30th Infantry Division recalled. "The trees were gone, the houses gone, you couldn't tell where the roads had been. The air was hot from the explosions, like the world hadn't cooled down yet. For days, the earth itself seemed to breathe. Smoke drifted from hidden fires beneath the soil,
and the air reeked of fuel and death. Yet amidst the ruin, the army marched through the gap that the Liberators had torn open. In England, at bases like Hettle, Wendling, and Adelbridge, the men who had flown the mission were still trying to comprehend what they had done. They had been part of the largest tactical bombing operation in history, 3,000 aircraft delivering nearly 9,000 tons of explosives in 2 hours. To them, it had been another mission, another target, another sky full of flak and smoke. But the reports filtering back from the front told a different story. The German line was gone, and the road to Paris was open. The B-24 crews who had spent years bombing factories and refineries in Germany had finally seen their work touch the battlefield directly. "For once," said Lieutenant Mike Russo, the bombardier from the Duchess of Dallas, "we didn't just bomb a place on a map, we bombed for the guys down there in the mud. We gave them a way out." For the first time, strategic air power and ground warfare had fused into one. Not separate branches of the military, but a single, coordinated machine. It was a vision that would define modern war for the rest of the century. The price had been high. Hundreds of American soldiers had been killed by bombs that fell short, entire platoons erased by errors of timing and wind. Among the crews themselves, dozens of aircraft never returned from the mission. But for every tragedy, there was the unshakable truth that Operation Cobra had worked. The front in France had been smashed beyond repair. When General Eisenhower received the first reports from the breakout, he turned to his staff and said, "Gentlemen, this is it." Within 3 weeks, Paris would be liberated. Within a month, the Allies would be at the gates of Germany. The war's end was still far off, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The destruction unleashed by the B-24s had done more than kill an army. It had broken the myth of Nazi invincibility. The same industrial power that had built the bombers had built the tanks, the trucks, the ships, the fuel, an entire continent of motion. The German war machine, once the terror of Europe, was now facing a force of creation and annihilation it could never match. In Berlin, the news of Panzer Lehr's destruction stunned Hitler. His fortress Europe had been breached not by artillery or armor, but by an avalanche of American bombers. He raged in disbelief, ordering his generals to counterattack, to rebuild the line, to fight to the last man. But there were no men left to fight. The air itself had devoured them. The shock waves from Operation Cobra went far beyond Normandy. German commanders across the Western Front realized that static defense, their cherished doctrine since 1940, was finished. They could no longer hold fixed lines against a nation that could drop an ocean of fire from 20,000 feet. "The Americans fight with factories," one Wehrmacht colonel bitterly said. "We fight with courage, and courage melts." As the Allies swept across France, the B-24 Liberator continued its war. Over the next year, it would bomb bridges across the Rhine, oil fields in Ploiesti, submarine pens in Norway, and airfields across Italy. In the Pacific, other Liberators would strike at Japanese strongholds from island bases, their long wings carrying the war across oceans. But it was in Normandy that the bomber's legacy reached its peak. Not as a weapon of terror, but as a weapon of liberation. For the men who built it, the B-24 was proof that industry could become destiny. For the men who flew it, it was a reminder that power always came with a price. She was a beast, but she was our beast, and she ended the war faster than any general could have. After the war, thousands of B-24s were scrapped, melted down into peacetime steel. Their wings became cars, their rivets became tools, their engines became relics in museums. Yet their legacy lived on in every jet bomber that followed, in every doctrine that said control of the air meant control of the earth. Operation Cobra became a textbook case in military academies, a turning point in modern combined arms warfare. Historians would debate its morality, its precision, its cost. But they all agreed on one thing: it worked. The line that had held since D-Day vanished in a single morning. The road to victory had begun with the roar of engines over Normandy. Years later, survivors of Panzerlehr returned to visit the fields where their division had died. The grass had grown back. The craters had softened into green depressions filled with rainwater. Farmers plowed over what had once been their trenches. But even then, on quiet days, the ground still gave up fragments, a shard of armor, a buckle, a bullet casing, reminders of the day when the sky fell. And in the museums of England and France, one silver bomber still stands, its wings outstretched, its bomb bays open. A small plaque beneath it reads, "They broke the wall, and through the fire came freedom." For the men of the 8th Air Force, for the engineers of Willow Run, and for the soldiers who walked through the gap at Saint-Lô, the memory never faded. It was not pride they felt, but understanding. The B-24 had been more than metal and engines. It was the embodiment of what happens when a nation decides that no wall, no empire, no tyranny will stand forever. When the Liberators took off that morning, they didn't just carry bombs. They carried the weight of the modern world, its industry, its fear, its hope. And when they came home, the war itself had changed.